Please don't leave us here.
I won't leave my family.
Please don't leave us here, she begged. The giant mountain man answered, I won't leave my family. Snow cut the mountain like broken glass, and the wind howled through the pines as if it were searching for someone to blame for the suffering it carried. A woman stood at the edge of a collapsing trail with two frightened children clinging to her coat, her knees shaking, her breath coming out in white clouds of panic, and the words, Please don't leave us here, spilling from her mouth like a final prayer. Across from her loomed a giant of a man, broad as the cliffs themselves, his beard iced over, his shadow swallowing the ground. And in his eyes burned a fierce promise shaped by loss and loyalty, the kind that could move mountains when everything else had already fallen apart. Before the storm carries us deeper into this story, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Legend of the Wild West if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength that still lives in the human heart. Your support helps stories like this find their way home. The giant mountain man had not always lived above the world, away from towns and trails, away from names and memories. Once, long before the snowstorms and the solitude, he had walked among people with his shoulders hunched low, trying to be smaller than he was. His size had always marked him as different, useful for hard labor, feared when voices rose and tempers flared. He learned early that the world liked him best when he was silent and strong, when he carried burdens without complaint and disappeared afterward. When tragedy came, it came fast and without mercy, taking his wife in a spring flood and his infant son to a fever that no prayer could cool. The town offered words and distance, sympathy and suspicion in equal measure, and he took what little he had left and climbed into the mountains where grief could echo without witnesses. Up there, life stripped itself down to the essentials: chop wood, set traps, mend shelter, read the sky, listen to the animals. Days passed without voices, nights without dreams. He learned the language of snow and stone, learned how to survive on little and expect less. Over time, the pain dulled, not because it healed, but because it froze into something he could carry. He told himself he had no family anymore, only memory, only the promise he made to himself to never fail those who depended on him again. That promise would soon be tested in ways he never imagined. The woman and her children were never meant to be on that mountain. They had been passing through the valley below, following rumors of work and shelter after the last town burned in a dry season fire that left nothing but blackened chimneys and names written on the wind. The man she trusted to guide them vanished at the first sign of trouble, leaving her with two young lives in a path that turned deadly without warning. When the storm descended, it erased the trail and the sky together, and panic drove them upward instead of down. Hunger gnawed, fear hollowed them out, and hope thinned to a thread they held only because letting go meant the end. When the giant appeared through the snowfall, they thought he was a trick of the storm, a figure shaped by terror and cold. His presence stopped them in their tracks, and for a moment everything balanced on a knife's edge. He saw them the way one sees a sudden wound, shocking and impossible to ignore. He could turn away, return to his cabin, shut the door on another reminder of a life he no longer lived. The mountain had taught him that survival often meant choosing yourself, yet the children's faces, pale and trembling, stirred something he had buried deep. Responsibility pressed against his chest like a weight he recognized too well. He did not speak in that moment, but his actions began to answer the plea carried on the wind. He assessed the storm, the slope, the failing light. He knew the risks, knew that bringing strangers into his life could reopen scars that never truly closed. Still, the promise inside him flared, and he chose it. He turned his back on the trail and moved with deliberate strength, signaling them to follow, breaking the wind with his body, carving a path toward shelter that existed only because he had built it with his own hands. The cabin was rough but solid, anchored against the mountain's fury. Inside, the air smelled of pine and smoke, and warmth crept back into frozen fingers. He set to work without ceremony, stoking the fire, portioning food he had carefully stored for the long winter. Each movement carried the quiet competence of someone who had learned survival the hard way. The woman watched him with a mix of gratitude and fear, unsure what kindness cost in a world that had already taken so much from her. The children, exhausted beyond tears, slept near the fire, their small chests rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Days passed as the storm refused to loosen its grip. Outside, the world was erased into white, and inside, a fragile routine formed. He taught the children simple tasks, how to keep busy, how to listen to the weather. The woman helped where she could, mending, cooking, learning the rhythms of a life lived close to the edge. Trust grew slowly like thawing ground, and with it came stories told without words, memories carried in glances and shared silences. The mountain man felt the ache of old wounds stir, not as pain alone, but as something warmer, something that felt like purpose. Trouble did not announce itself with thunder. It crept in with a cracked beam, a dwindling supply, the knowledge that storms do not end just because people wish them to. When a late-night wind tore part of the roof loose, the giant went out into the dark, tying down what he could, fighting the mountain on its own terms. He returned injured, blood dark against the snow, and the woman's fear sharpened into action. She tended to him with hands that shook but did not falter. And in that care, a boundary crossed quietly. They were no longer strangers sharing a storm. They were something like a family, formed not by blood but by choice. As the weather eased, new dangers emerged. Supplies ran low and the path back down remained treacherous. Worse, the mountain carried rumors as surely as it carried storms. Men searching for resources and shelter moved higher, bringing desperation and greed in equal measure. The giant knew these types, knew how fear turned men cruel when survival felt scarce. He prepared the cabin, set boundaries, watched the slopes with a hunter's patience. He understood that protecting others meant inviting conflict, and the weight of that choice settled heavy on his shoulders. When the men came, they came with demands and suspicion, seeing only a big man with a stash worth taking. The confrontation unfolded like a slow burn, tension tightening with every step closer. The giant stood firm, not as a threat but as a wall, unmovable and clear. He did not need to raise his voice. His presence carried the truth of a man who had lost everything once and refused to lose again. The woman and children waited inside, fear pressing in, hope clinging to the sound of his steady resolve. The standoff ended without blood, driven back by the certainty that some lines cannot be crossed without consequence. When silence returned, it felt earned. That night as the fire crackled low, the mountain man understood something had changed forever. He could no longer pretend he lived only for himself. The promise he made long ago had found new meaning. Family, he realized, was not only what fate gave you, sometimes it was what you chose to protect when the world offered every excuse to turn away. Spring arrived reluctantly, loosening the mountain's grip inch by inch. Paths reopened, and with them came choices that could not be delayed. The woman knew she could not stay forever, not without turning refuge into dependence. The giant knew that letting go would test the very promise that had carried him through the storm. The children sensed the shift and clung tighter, afraid that safety was always temporary. The days stretched, heavy with what remained unsaid. Each sunrise a reminder that change waits for no one. When the time came to descend, preparation filled the cabin with a quiet sadness. The giant packed supplies, marked trails, taught lessons that felt like goodbyes even when they were framed as advice. At the edge of the path, the mountain stood tall and indifferent, a witness to choices made and promises kept. The woman's eyes held gratitude and fear in equal measure, and the children looked to the giant as if he were part of the mountain itself, something solid that should not be left behind. What happened next reshaped all of them. The giant did not return to his cabin alone. He walked with them, step by careful step, guiding them down to the valley, through thawing streams and uncertain ground. In town, he found a place for them, work for her, a school for the children. He did not vanish when the danger passed. He stayed near enough to matter, far enough to let them grow. In doing so, he learned that loyalty did not require isolation, and strength did not demand silence. Years passed, marked by seasons and small victories. The children grew, carrying the mountain in their bones, resilient and kind. The woman built a life stitched together by effort and grace, never forgetting the storm that could have ended everything. The giant split his time between the heights and the valley, a bridge between worlds. People learned his name not as a legend but as a man who showed up when it counted. The promise he lived by became visible in the lives he touched. On a quiet winter evening, when snow fell gently instead of with fury, the giant stood at the edge of the trail and looked back up at the mountain. He understood now that leaving did not always mean abandonment, and staying did not always require walls. Family was the act of returning again and again, even when the path was hard. The words that once trembled in the cold had become a truth he carried easily. He would not leave his family, because he had learned how to recognize them wherever they stood. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of the power of choosing kindness when it costs something real, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Legend of the Wild West. Your engagement tells us these stories matter and helps us bring more heart into the world. Before the ending fades, please leave a comment sharing what family means to you, or a moment when someone chose not to leave you behind. The mountain remains patient and vast, but what endures longer are the promises we keep when the storm is loudest, and the quiet courage to say we will not leave when staying can change everything.